Can I begin by expressing a huge thank you to each of you, despite the inclemency of the weather and the subject matter for tonight. You've come anyway, so that's wonderful. My name's Rob Setter. I'm the Chief Executive of the Public Service Commission, long-term advocate for IPAA, a past president, and they run out of people to lead the stuff tonight, so you've got me for the gig. Can I acknowledge the Turrbal and Jagera people, the custodians of the land on which we have come together this evening, and pay my respects to past, present and emerging leaders. Also acknowledge IPAA councillors that are here. I think Neil Scales was to be here, but he's probably building a road somewhere. Individual members of IPAA, organisational members, because each of the departments contribute as organisations towards IPAA, and it actually is the sustaining block upon which we are able to continue to grow and sponsor events like tonight. Just for housekeeping, for those who haven't been on level 41 before, toilets are out to the left, and you just go, I think, women the first and then men are up the other end. Could I ask you just check your phones, make sure they're on silent. Don't want you to miss one skerrick of the conversation tonight. On the Couch, or Stewards on the Couch series, is an event sponsored by each of the jurisdictional IPAs, and its purpose is basically kind of an informal interview of key leaders to understand the leadership journey of successful public service leaders obviously in government, understand what has motivated them, understand their style, their priorities, and of course their vision for the work that they do. Obviously each of us will take away from tonight a range of bits and pieces in terms of that, but it's quite a unique, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Mike Kaiser as the one in the hot seat for the evening. Mike's known to all of you, I would imagine, as Director General, Department of State Development, Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning, but has a long history in the private sector, in the consulting world and also in government. But the department that he leads is a key agency in terms of economic growth for the state, both through good infrastructure planning outcomes. And I'm hopeful that tonight that you'll get some insight as to what motivates Mike to drive this very complicated and challenging agenda, not only within the department, but across the whole of the government and into the private sector as well. Mike brings more than 30 years of experience to the role, having built a successful career in private and public sector leadership and consultancy. And from a government perspective, he has been in a unique position of being Chief of Staff to Premiers in New South Wales and Queensland, as well as in the private sector and then back into government as a Director General. And I remember an early conversation I had with Mike was talking about what's the journey after being a Chief of Staff, which was his role before, in terms of positioning. Being so young at the time, it's a journey. I think there was some insights there about peaking early and then continuing to grow and be different in that particular space. I'm also pleased to acknowledge and thank the moderator tonight, Russell Fairbanks. Russell's known to all of you. Normally we'd have a renowned journalist or public affairs commentator, but we've got Russell, which I'm really pleased about. Russell's been partnering with government for some time now in the recruiting space, particularly at Chief Executive level, and probably known to each and all of you, because one element that is a feature, I guess, of Russell's business and how he works with government is actually in terms of applicant care and understanding the positioning and growing of capability across the sector. And I value him, as I do all of the recruiters who work with the Public Service Commission and DPC in terms of the role that we've got. Russell established Luminary in 2019, having been in various other recruiting agencies, and has attempted to position Luminary quite uniquely into the market, and no doubt at some stage you'll get a chance to, if not experience that, understand what that might be. One thing about Russell, he has shares in Short Street Coffee Shop, because basically he's there every other day, and that's a great thing, because what he's doing is actually working with each of our senior executives in terms of positioning them. I know tonight Russell will be as kind as he can be in terms of Mike, who I see has managed to dress appropriately, given anyone who follows his LinkedIn profile, and we'll hear more about that as well. Now for tonight, it'll go about 50 minutes, and I'd encourage you to, there'll be question opportunities at the end of that 50 minutes or so, but do stay around because there's a networking opportunity afterwards out in the main foyer, and I'd encourage you to and then engage informally both with Russell and with Mike, and of course with other IPA members. So welcome everybody, and thank you for coming along tonight. Over to you, Russell.
Thank you, Rob. And I have to say, one of the most disturbing things about presenting at an event like this is realising that you, at a stage of life where you need to print off everything in large font and that you need to bold everything on your iPad for the questions that you're asking. So Mike, I've been following you avidly on social media for the last few years. And I've got a few questions that will delve into your murky social media past. but one thing I am very curious about is sort of reflections of a leader when you look back over your career. And you recently commented about, your 25-year-old self. I think you made a comment about wearing flares and a rather apricot jacket. So, Mike, where you are now in your career, if you could time travel and talk to Mike at age 25, what's some of the advice that you would give him?
Well, because I posted it. Don't be photographed with that mullet, and don't be photographed in an apricot jacket and flares. And I only put on LinkedIn the photograph of me with the mullet, not the flares and the apricot jacket, so I spared you all that. So, you were being serious.
I was being deadly serious. I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? As we get older, we often think, gosh, if only I'd known that at that stage of my life and career. And you've also been quite candid about the learnings you've had from setbacks along the way. So, again, thinking back to your younger self, what's some of the sage advice you would give, or you would give any young person?
Oh, God, Russell. Well, in my case, it's probably, if you want to knock this topic off early, the advice I'd give my 25-year-old self is don't sign that blank enrolment form. That will end your parliamentary career in a few years' time. That would be pretty good advice.
Yeah. I wasn't intending to go straight to that one, but
I just thought we'd knock it off early.
Yeah, we've got it out in the open. So look, that's an interesting one. So at that stage of your life, you were thinking a political career, and that had no limits, presumably, in your career aspirations.
Yeah, I wasn't quite there at the age of 25, but I was a party official at 25. Mm-hmm. I was destined for Parliament. I got to Parliament. I spent all of 13 months there, and then got derailed by something really stupid that I'd done some 15 years earlier, and so that would have been good advice. But yes, I mean, I was on the traditional railway tracks of a political career. I think party official, into Parliament, ministry, opposition, ministry, opposition, ministry, for who knows how many years, and I'd probably be right about now considering retiring from Parliament. And the seat that I got was the seat of Woodridge, and so it was likely to have presented me with a lifelong career in politics, on the Labor side of things. But I can honestly say, without a word of hesitation or doubt in my mind, that I'm incredibly grateful now, looking back, that what happened to me happened. I think that would have been a bloody boring career. That would have been terrible in comparison to what I got to do, which was a mix of private consulting in my own right, working for NBN Co. back when the NBN was first. I was employee number 31 by the time I left 4.5 years later. We had 3,000 employees, so being part of that was fantastic. Becoming a partner at KPMG, now doing this, I honestly think is a far richer and more rewarding set of career and life experiences than I would have had I sat in Parliament. So, although I was devastated at the time, not least because with a young family, I suddenly found myself with no income and with a seriously tarnished reputation, given what I stupidly did some 15 years earlier. I'm glad it happened. I'm genuinely glad it happened.
So let's talk about the build back from that, because the resilience. I meet plenty of executives who have, professional or personal setbacks of some kind, and some people respond and overcome them better than others. What skills and experiences did you take from that set you up for your future career?
Oh, there were 2 times. Then, I said I resigned from Parliament. The reality was it was one of those situations where I had no choice. So I found myself without a career and an income on that occasion. And then when leaving NBN Co, the same thing happened. I set myself back up in consulting. So that wasn't too bad financially. But I count those 2 things now as real. I'm not a religious person, but kind of in inverted commas as blessings, because they really do build resilience. Not much can knock you around when you've been through experiences like that. So it's built up a degree of resilience. It kind of means that I'm not too fazed by things which might faze others. My hero, one of my heroes, Shackleton, I don't know if people know the story of Shackleton, but he was an Antarctic explorer. On his way to the South Pole, ship got frozen in ice a long way from land. Ship gets crushed and sinks. So he's out there with his whole crew with summer coming, which is going to melt the ice. So he's, in a lot of shit. And so, one of the things he famously said was, difficulties are just things to overcome. And I think, given some of the tough experiences I've had in my career, I now take that attitude.
Love it, thank you. And NBN, I remember meeting you on a very wet, miserable day as you trudged into an office at the time that I was working in as you were leaving politics, and I think you were looking for some advice about career options, and ultimately you had the NBN.
I was looking for a job, Russell.
I
wasn't looking for your advice.
Okay, I'm just trying to position it a bit. So yes, you were looking for a job.
You were no help, by the way.
Well, I seem to remember giving you the advice to get out of town, which you did. So you went down to Sydney and NBN. Yep. And employee number 30. So let's talk about NBN. I mean, obviously, politics really did affect that organisation. There's no denying it. When you see what you went there to do and where the organisation is today and where we are with that infrastructure, and I know you have, in your current role, you're a big supporter of governments having bold visions. So what does that look like for you? And again, perhaps referencing the NBN experience.
Yeah, I went to NBN Co after leaving Anna Bligh's office. I was Anna Bligh's Chief of Staff. I went to NBN Co because I genuinely wanted to get out of politics. Like I'd left Parliament, resurrected my career, been the Chief of Staff to the New South Wales Premier, been the Chief of Staff to the Queensland Premier, but left that with a great determination to leave political involvement, having kind of resurrected myself, got myself back into the Labor Party, rebuilt my career and reputation. I remember the day it happened. It was during the 2009 election, and the 2009 election looked like it was going very, very badly for Anna Bligh. She ended up winning the election, but one morning we were having a strategy group meeting at 7 a.m, as you do in a campaign, and I looked around the room and I thought, there's the Premier, Treasurer and Deputy Premier. They're all going to keep their jobs even if Labor loses. They may have different jobs, but they'll keep their jobs. They'll keep an income. There was our ad agency. I thought, well, they'll all be okay. There was our research agency. Their jobs weren't at risk. And it suddenly dawned on me, I was this only silly bastard in the room who was actually going to lose their job if Labor lost. And that's when the penny dropped. I was approaching 50 and I just thought, I have got to get out of here and start doing something of more substance. And so that's when I went to NBN Co. NBN Co was a great place to go to. I started off there in the traditional kind of government relations, corporate affairs role for them, but then very quickly was able to re-enter a kind of a quasi-engineering stream, which is my profession, supposedly. And so I was able to kind of, build back a sense of career and worth that wasn't related to politics in any way. So that was important for me to be able to make that transition. It was also a fantastic project. You know, it was big and bold and, you know, I know it's an overused term, but it was a nation-building project. And I'm at my best, I think, where I can find purposeful work. You know, work where there is a really, really clear purpose is something that, you know, rings my bells. So NBN Co for me was both a kind of a personal transition, a career transition, and helped me, I think, form a lot of my views around, you know, what those kinds of projects can do.
And you've previously said, and I'm not going to quote you, but I am going to refer to notes, but you have previously said that government is at its best when it leads. And then you've also said many times that public and private sector leaders need to give it a crack. So what does that look like to you? You know, what does being bold and visionary look like? Because of course, in a 24-hour news cycle and one of social media, which we're going to get to in a moment, you know, there's a lot of risk in that, being visionary and bold with leadership.
Yeah, look, one of the things that has honestly shocked me coming back into, I mean, I was about to say coming back into the public service. To be honest, my genuine public service career, if you don't include being an MP or staffing for politicians, my public service career goes like this. Class 1 graduate electrical engineer for Queensland Rail, Director General. I reckon that's the way to do a public service career. But kind of coming back into, you know, the broader concept of public service as opposed to the private sector. One of the things that shocked me, because I was out of that game completely for, you know, 12 years, floating around doing other things, is just how bloody timid everyone's become. Like, there is a real timidity in the public service. There's not, and I think I get why that's happened. It's the pressure of the media, it's our advice sometimes not being appreciated by politicians. There's a whole bunch of reasons for it. I really notice it because I left and came back in a way that I suspect people who have stayed might not notice it. And so I spent a lot of time trying to remind, you know, my team about what the role of the public service is. The role of the public service is to stand toe-to-toe with the private sector and to find ways to, together, solve society's problems. But that means us being as entrepreneurial as they are, as bold as they are, as courageous as they are. You know, and having seen the relationship from both sides, the private sector will take advantage of government if public servants don't stand toe-to-toe with them and get the best outcome for the people. And so, you know, boldness in our advice, boldness in our action, you know, preparedness to always try to get the best outcome for the people of Queensland, I think are important values to instill. And so, you know, I love going to private sector forums now and saying, you know, all that neoclassical, you know, that neoliberal bullshit about balancing, you know, levelling playing fields. I'm not interested in levelling playing fields. I'm interested in tilting them in favour of the industries we want to create. I'm interested in the public service being prepared to take appropriate risk. I am interested in the public service being prepared to have a crack, to, you know, to create the industries and to create the livability and lifestyle that Queenslanders deserve. You know, it's that kind of boldness and preparedness to have a go and preparedness to be frank and fearless in our advice that I think is a bit too missing at the moment.
So how do you cut through the shit then? Because the bureaucracy is there. You and I have talked about this before. You've talked about it publicly. Having a crack sometimes means going up against established rules, procedures and norms. How do you cut through that without blowing up the system?
Well, I don't, you know...
I know you're not an anarchist, don't worry.
No, no, it's not. I mean, you can do it within the rules. I'm not suggesting that we become reckless or, you know, or certainly, you know, corrupt, as has been some of Queensland's history in the past. I'm not advocating for that at all. But being appropriate in a public sector context does not mean you have to be risk adverse. You know, take appropriate risk, tilt playing fields, you know, have a go. I think it's all possible within our existing frameworks and constraints. It's just getting the will back and being prepared to do it, I think. And, you know, we talk about this in the two agencies that I've led. we've had these explicit conversations. It's about giving people permission and encouragement, and it's also about honestly saying, and a lot of leaders I think sort of pay lip service to this, honestly saying, if you've had a go, if you've had a crack and you fall on your face, that's okay. You know, as long as you haven't been corrupt or stupid and you haven't taken inappropriate risk, you know, if you've had a go and the advice isn't taken or the project doesn't work, then it's the role of a leader, I think, to celebrate that. It's to put those people on a pedestal as well as the people who have succeeded, and to say, you know, they've done the right thing, they've had a go. It's not about whether or not, you know, advice is taken, the project fails or succeeds. It's about being prepared to take the appropriate risk.
And you've had the experience of working in the private sector and particularly professional services consulting firm. How can the private sector work more collaboratively, or do they work collaboratively with the public sector? And then added to that, do they understand the roles and responsibilities of many of their public sector colleagues?
Look, you know, the other thing that really kind of also makes me bristle is the notion that the private sector is in any sense, you know, kind of better than the public sector. You know, innovation happens in the private sector, not the public sector. Bullshit. Right? You know, they're less bureaucratic and more organised and more efficient. Bullshit. You know, having worked at KPMG, I can tell you that particularly in the context of a partnership model of trying to run an organisation, they can be terribly inefficient, they can be terribly bureaucratic, they can be terribly wasteful. So there is no better or worse in that relationship. Here's my take on the relationship. Let's not forget what corporations are. Corporations exist because citizens, through government, created, you know, anywhere in the Western world, it's roughly the same story. Citizens through government create Corporations Acts or their equivalent. Those Corporations Acts exist to create corporations which are given a legal status like a person. So it means that, you know, if something goes wrong, you can sue the corporation. The corporation goes bankrupt. I'm not a lawyer, by the way, so this is a bush lawyer's description, but it's a point I want to make. So, you know, that right or that protection to limited liability and to, you know, a more favourable tax treatment is granted by citizens. It's an opportunity provided by citizens through government. And they do that in order to create structures that allow people to take risks and to be rewarded for solving society's problems. That's the trade-off. Corporations Act and corporations are created to solve society's problems. There's a deal, there's an inherent deal there between the private sector and the public sector. The deal is we grant you limited liability and favourable tax treatment in order to solve our problems, not to enrich yourselves. You know, if that happens along the way, that's fine. But the purpose of the private sector, actually, and the protections that parliaments give the private sector through Corporations Acts, is so that they can solve society's problems. So, you know, in our department, we have a lot of dealings with the private sector, and I like it when they come with that attitude of saying, there's a problem that we think we can solve and make some money along the way. We get pretty pissed off, deservedly, you know, as we should, when the rent seekers come to say, we've found a way of enriching ourselves and we're dressing it up as public purpose. So that was a long explanation. But I just want to try to, you know, get this sense of they're no better than us. They have a role to play, but let's never forget the corporation exists through the will of citizens and the willingness of citizens to create that structure. And the only reason that that's done is so they can solve society's problems.
And thinking then about career pathways, I mean, you've seen individuals, executives move from public to private sector and back again, gaining experiences and building their skills along the way. It's not easy for everybody to make those transitions. I mean, sometimes it's, you know, they don't have the right connections or networks or getting the private sector to understand what they might have done in a public sector role and how that's translatable to the private sector, and in fact the other way around. From your experience as somebody who has navigated those worlds, what can we do to provide those opportunities for mobility across public, private, and in fact the university sector too?
Yeah, look, there's no right career. I mean, I don't think, anyone who's spent all their life in the public sector is no more worthy or less worthy than someone who's spent all their life in the private sector. It can be difficult to make the transition. There are different mindsets. The biggest transition that I had to make was in fact not what was kind of public sector to private sector, but it was from politics to the private sector, because, the private sector tends to see people in those roles as a handy Rolodex of contacts. That's the worth that they see in someone who's coming out of the political sector, the political service. And it took me a long time to demonstrate worth beyond that, to actually get them to look beyond who I knew to the other things that I could do. So I found that personally to be a much harder transition. I think there's more the public sector can do. It's not easy, but I think there is more the public sector and private sector can do to kind of organise exchange, to give people those experiences. I think it's terribly important with young people who we get in as graduates in the public sector, for example, for us not to discourage them if they want to go and do private sector work. We in the two agencies I've led, we set up graduate programs, agency-specific graduate programs, and in both places, one of the arguments that was used against doing that was, we'll get them in and they'll just leave. Well, good. If they leave having experienced the public service, they will go into the private sector with that, with the benefit of that experience and the ability to, at least know what occurs on the other side of it.
Yeah, keep training them up. We'll keep recruiting them. Yeah. That would be great. Thank you. So if I could take...
I saw... Is anyone here from KPMG? They haven't come tonight. They often come to these events. It's interesting that they didn't tonight. I saw Ron Zubrick from KPMG, who's a good friend of mine, posted the other day some job vacancies in KPMG for, I forget the exact description, but it kind of said, but part of the description was public policy. And I commented saying, of course, if you really want a career in public policy, you could join the public service. I'm not surprised they're not here. Really.
So let's actually go back to this KPMG time, because you said you went there and there was probably the interest in your ability to open doors. Perhaps,
I'd long overcome that by the time I hit KPMG. This is when I first left Parliament. My reputation was shot. I set up a consulting firm. I got plenty of interest in that. In fact, I think to this day it's still the most money I've ever made. I got plenty of interest in it, but it was back in the days prior to lobbying being regulated, frankly. And I had to start off, to earn an income, I had to start off as a lobbyist, because that's the value people saw in what I could provide. I'm pleased to say that over the 3 years that I did that, I was able to transition that into something else. It was during that period that I made that transition. By the time I hit KPMG, I was not hired by KPMG for that.
So we met very early in your time at KPMG, and you were building the social responsibility and trust, which then a consulting firm investing in that area was novel. And grew that practice nationally. Tell us a bit about that journey, because obviously fee-earning consulting firms investing in new areas that at that time were probably footnotes in annual reports. How did you build that practice up? Those large consulting firms, there's nothing they won't do. If you make it... If there's money to be made.
If there's money to be made. They're partnerships and they're for-profit organisations, and don't get me wrong, there's lots of good people doing lots of good work for all of the right reasons. But I went to KPMG, in fact, to work in their industrial relations practice. I felt that's what got me in there, but I felt like a fraud. I don't know anything about industrial relations practice. I've got some instinctive feel for union behaviour because of my political background, nothing about industrial relations. So I felt fraudulent, so I went to them and said, look, I think that there's a gap in the market. We have, all of the big four have practices that help CFOs. They all have practices that help COOs. They all have practices that help CEOs. They all have practices that help boards. No one's offering something that helps a corporate affairs executive. So I think I can build a values-based practice around public affairs, ESG. They said, what's ESG? This was 7 years ago. What's this ESG thing? So it was around that notion, which I think has always been a bit of a driver for me, and this only makes sense to me looking back, but a bit of a driver for me has always been that relationship between the private sector, the public sector and citizens. Getting that balanced and everyone playing their right role is great for society. So that's the proposition I put to them. It's, can you back me to build a practice which gets, a values-based approach going to essentially that triangle.
Well, so tell us about that, because you're catching a wave before it comes. 7 years ago, I know it seems weird to think that 7 years ago there was such low understanding of the principles of ESG and corporate trust and responsibility, but we live in that world today. How did you convince sceptical partners that that was a horse to back?
They're pretty good, they're pretty good at that. It wasn't hard to get them to back it, because they said, oh yeah, you've made a case that there's a gap in the market, have a go. If it hadn't have worked, I'm sure I would have been soaked up somewhere else in the organisation. Tell you what though, the Banking Royal Commission, that made my partnership at KPMG. Thank you, Westpac. I worked
Nothing like making money on people's misery, is there?
I worked for 2 years advising the CEO and executive team and board at Westpac in the lead up to and through the Royal Commission. That's what really made the practice. That was a real watershed moment in Australia's kind of corporate history, or a recent watershed moment in Australia's corporate history around the realisation that trust and corporate behaviour, is important, and that there's something beyond shareholder value that they needed to pursue, that there was a broader thing that they needed to take more seriously. The private sector was already by then riding the whole corporate social responsibility wave, but it was a tick and flick. It was oh yeah, these are a couple of pages we whack into the annual report. Being able to use the Royal Commission and use the practice that I worked in KPMG to sort of say, no, there are greater obligations to society than this, and the Royal Commission is calling them out. There's something that corporations need to get hold of. So it was all around, the idea of stakeholder capitalism as opposed to shareholder primacy. So, built a practice in a 30-person team around the country off the back of that.
Yeah, remarkable achievement.
Yep. It did quite a bit of government work during that period too, but the bulk of the practice was built on that. We did AQP. Remember that, Rachel? AQP. We weren't responsible for the governance model.
I'm going to open up shortly.
The moods were not our idea.
I'm going to open up shortly to some questions. I know there'll be many in the room, but one thing that is undeniable is that you are, without doubt, the most socially media active public servant in the country. And I know you're not on Twitter, so Musk is fine. There's no character limit here. But I think anybody who follows Mike on LinkedIn, which is your primary platform, I think.
Only platform.
Yeah, only platform, knows that you take steps to really promote the role that you do and the currency across the agency as a whole. So tell us about that, because you were one of the very first and visibly proactive CEOs to get out there on that platform as a new DG. And I think actually as an acting DG at the time.
Yeah, I kept waiting for someone to tell me to stop, and no one did.
Okay.
So I kept going.
That might happen after today.
Look, I think it's important. I think it's important for public sector leaders to be active. I mean, I don't think we can rebalance any of the debates that we've been talking about, like the role of the public sector vis-a-vis the private sector. I don't think there's, we can't tackle any of that unless we get more active in voicing that. So, I don't want to make it seem like it's really calculated. It's not, especially on a Friday night. But the things I use social media for are, one, promoting the public sector and the ideals of public sector. I think I do a bit of promotion of that. I like to use it to thank people. Like I like to use it to give recognition to people within the department. But I also like to, and this isn't my term, it's someone else's, I also like to use it to build intimacy at scale. Or if intimacy is too much for you, familiarity at scale. Because I think, the kind of the...
But that's a really good point, because there are people that I know and I've seen them interact with you on that platform, and then I've chatted to them and I've said, oh, how do you know Mike? And I don't. I just see them on LinkedIn, and we have conversations on LinkedIn, which is lovely. I mean, it's an accessibility that you don't often get as a leader. So,
well, that's the point. I mean, I think, the second thing, I talked before about one thing that surprised me about coming back to public service was the timidity of the public service. The second is, just how respectful people are of DGs.
Well, they should be, shouldn't they?
Well, they should be, but I can't quite get the right word, but it's like it's overdone.
Yeah, you obviously haven't worked in the education sector.
Maybe others have a different experience, but getting people to be comfortable with you, getting people to tell you what they really think, getting people to challenge you is actually pretty bloody hard.
So this
was never hard for Chantel Laura. She always told me what she thought any day of the week, She's always prepared to take my ego out for a mow. But most people are too respectful. Right? I came from KPMG where, leading large young teams who never hesitated to tell you what they thought of you, your stupid idea, the work that you're asking them to do. Suddenly you land as a DG in the public sector and, you're flat out getting people to open their mouth and tell you what they think. So that familiarity or intimacy at scale, and some of the more daggy stuff I do on LinkedIn, is all about saying, hey, I'm approachable. You don't, it's just, so I don't want to make it sound too calculated. It's
no, but being authentic and open in that forum does come with risk, because when you're putting yourself out there with opinion, then you are liable for somebody to want to take a crack, and we all know that social media breeds those people. So how do you deal with that kind of dissent that comes with the territory? And also, I mean, in Brisbane, we are one of those towns that is, preoccupied by one of the newspapers, and they will often pick up commentary and use it for their own end. So, how do you? What filtering, if any, do you have to adopt on a Friday night with a glass and a wine?
As I've learned, because Rachel's received complaints about some of my posts. As I've learned, on a Friday night, I just have to hand my phone to my wife and say, no matter how much I beg you, do not give it back to me, because I've been drinking and I shouldn't get on LinkedIn. So you can't be stupid about it, right? You can't, you have to, if you're going to be, as a public servant, if you're going to be active on LinkedIn, and I'd encourage people to be, particularly leaders, you've got to be a bit deliberate about it. You've got to, there is a line. There is a line, and I think, I don't mind pushing it, but I try to stay on the right side of that line.
But it's obviously a good platform to air some of these big issues and get direct feedback.
Surprisingly so. I mean, I'm constantly surprised at how much feedback I get about it, how people engage me in conversation, in the ideas that I've kind of tried to promote on LinkedIn. It blows me away. I'd never, I'm an old bloke, I didn't realise that this thing existed. It seems to work.
So you've also said skepticism is underrated.
Oh, yeah.
So tell me about that.
Oh, well, especially for the public service, because, and especially in those agencies that deal, I think especially in those agencies that deal with the private sector, as I said before, the corporations that come and say we want to solve a societal problem, how can we help? They're the ones that we love to engage with. The ones who come and say we want to enrich ourselves and we're masking we're masking our intentions to enrich ourselves with this bullshit public purpose that we're putting forward. You've got to be able to see through that. So especially big spending agencies that are toe-to-toe with the private sector, you've got to hone your skepticism. Skepticism is different from cynicism. Like cynicism is not to be valued, I don't think, because they're different. But healthy skepticism is what dragged, humankind out of the dark ages. It underpins the scientific method and the way we make progress as a society. Healthy skepticism is really important for public servants, and we should train for it, I think. But it is different to cynicism, because cynicism, I think, is a negative emotion, whereas skepticism is a sensible caution about always wanting to test what you hear, always having your bullshit meter on high alert, and being prepared to test that.
I'm going to move to those that influence you now. Obviously, you're a fan of Shackleton, and I'm going to come to your music taste in a moment too. But you often reference Churchill. Is Churchill somebody that you admire as a political figure, or is it that some of the things that he has said and done over history you admire?
Look, I suppose because I've worked with political leaders, I've assumed leadership roles myself, both in the past and now. I've always had a real fascination, with leadership, and even, tried to do some formal study around it, which was pretty useless, but, it's just a demonstration of my interest in the topic. So I'm interested in historical figures in leadership. And one of the things I've often thought about is, what is that list of attributes or characteristics that every great leader has? Whether it's Churchill or, Kennedy or Martin Luther King or Margaret Thatcher or any of them, what's that list of things that they all have in common? And what I've concluded is that there isn't one. Because when you think about it, it can't be moral compass, because John F. Kennedy wouldn't have been a great leader if moral compass was a requirement. It can't be empathy, which is what most people say you need to have to be a great leader, because if it was, then Margaret Thatcher wouldn't have been a great leader. It can't be collaboration, because Nelson Mandela wasn't a particularly collaborative person with those whose views he opposed. So when you think about it, it's actually really challenging to get to a list of attributes that a great leader has. There's not a common list, which incidentally, for all the HR professionals in the room, I'm about to say something which you're likely to find deeply offensive.
Well, not just HR people, you're going to destroy my business model now, so
he's keen to move me on because he knows what I'm about to say. These capability models, apologies to the PSC as well, I'm deeply sceptical of them, because I think they're built on the notion that, and you've got one for sale, I'm sure. I'm deeply sceptical of them because they're built on the notion that, a person has gaps, and all you have to do is take a module and plug it in, and then you'll create a great leader. And it's bullshit, right? I mean, the only thing great leaders have in common is an ability to attract followers. And they all do that in their own unique, beautifully idiosyncratic way. And so our leadership training, I think, should be focused on helping people identify their strengths, getting them to double down on those and to find ways to use them to attract followers. It's not about pointing out what you've got missing in a list of leadership attributes. It can't be oratory, for example. It can't be brilliant oratory because, George VI was a stutterer, and yet the people of England loved him during World War II. You get what I mean? So I think we do leadership training all wrong.
Music for a moment, and then I'm going to hand to the audience. I hope there is a roving mic somewhere, otherwise you're going to have to speak very loudly. I have listened to the Ramones because I know they're one of your bands. I get it. The Chats, not so. But admittedly, I grew up on new romantic 80s pop. Tell me...
All the kids want to sniff some glue.
Yeah. So the Chats. Where's this fascination with these, what was it, 80s, 70s? I don't want to be too kind, go further back in time. Where do they fit in your influencing who you are?
Well, I like punk music because it's kind of like an up yours to authority. It's the same reason I joined the Labor Party. It's the same reason why I try to be a bit irreverent when it comes to, rules and authority. It's, I don't know, I was dropped on my head as a kid. I don't know why. I just like the, the punkiness of punk. So that's the reason.
So it's the inner rebel.
Yeah, kind of.
Love it.
Although I'm getting a bit older. I'm onto a new band, actually, the Flanger Pennies. Check out the Flanger Pennies.
There you go. Hot tip of the night. Now, I'm going to open it up to...
Great Brisbane band. Does anyone know the Flanger Pennies?
No, there you go. You're on your own.
F you and your stupid party? Great song.
So I'm going to open it. I think we have time for a few questions. There are other recruiters in the room. One thing I know about recruiters and a deadline, particularly where there's a bar, a free bar, is they'll be wanting to rush to the bar. But if there are any questions, if you do have a question, can you put your hand up so you can be identified and just tell us who you are and then pose the question to Mike.
Hey,
that's it, you're sacked.
I'm Owen Wareham and I work in Mike's comms team. You've riffed on the public sector and the private sector and you kind of alluded to the triangle of citizenry as well. I'm interested in kind of, you said what you think you need from the public sector and the private sector, but you didn't expand on the citizenry bit. I'd be really interested to hear what you think the modern citizen's role is in terms of shaping the public sector's behaviour.
Oh, well, I think it's, it's about both serving citizens. It's about public and private sector. The private sector, it's about reminding the private sector that they get the concessions they get from the law because they're expected to serve the citizenry. In the public sector, that's a bit easier concept to grasp because that's, kind of... Although, you know what, we still... I won't obviously name who, but, in the department in state development, local government infrastructure and planning, I hope I got that right, that, really early on when we were doing the purpose work for the department, I had an argument with one of the DDGs who, told me that we were here to serve the interests of the private sector. It's like, we're here to help the private sector. It's bullshit. We're here to help citizens. And if helping the private sector helps the public, like that old-fashioned notion of public value and public good is what always has to drive us. Even in our dealings with the government of the day, incidentally. When we're advising, of course we have to work for the government of the day, of course we have to implement their agenda, but we are also free to propose policy. We're not just the implementers of ideas that come from cabinet. We're also here to propose policy, and we're also here to challenge what we believe isn't in the public interest. And so, where citizens fit for government is at the centre of it. You've heard me always use the phrase, public value, public good, reminding the public service that we work for the people of Queensland. Of course we're here to implement the government's agenda, but we work for the people of Queensland, not the government in that sense. So that concept of where citizens fit for us, I think, is easier to get our head around. But there's evidence that even we forget what the right relationship should be. The private sector, it's much tougher. You have to remind them that they're given the environment that they're allowed to operate in, which is concessional in terms of liability and it's concessional in terms of tax because they're expected, that's the deal, they're given that to solve the public's problems.
So just building on the previous question, so where do you see academia and the university sector fitting into that? building out from a triangle. What are we up to now? A square?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously, there's civil society, community-based organisations, there's academia that fit into that model as well. I didn't think I'd be talking this much about this model, but, academia has obviously an important role to play. Again, work Rachel and I have done recently in rebuilding the relationship with academia is really important here in Queensland. Again, it's the third thing I'm mentioning tonight about what I noticed leaving and coming back is that our relationship with academia is not, I think, where it once was. And again, in our agency, where we face the challenges of completely retooling the Queensland economy around critical minerals, renewables, hydrogen, biofuels, sustainable aircraft fuel, a circular economy, you think about all those things. Every one of those things has one of the difficulties to overcome, which is what Shackleton was good at. One of the difficulties to overcome in creating every one of those industries as we completely retool the Queensland economy are technical and innovation challenges that I think academia is perfect, researchers in academia are perfectly placed to help us solve. We won't get there without it. So, obviously an important role to play.
Hi. Elliot Duff speaking. Just about your timidity of public servants, right? I mean, it's really a cultural issue, right? And that comes down to behaviours which comes from reward systems, right? So my question to you is about how do we reward non-timid behaviour and how do we stop punishing that behaviour as well? I mean, in my experience, I've been given a number of speeding tickets in the public service for
Were you speeding?
Yeah. It was actually on LinkedIn.
Was it reckless or did you have a good reason?
It was on LinkedIn where I sort of made comments around manufacturing or something like that, and some people got their noses out of joint and I got informed, or reaching out to a minister or something like that. So there is a culture there, and for people are not rewarded for their behaviour. Just some comments on what you think.
Well, yeah, okay. I mean, I don't want to be responsible for a sudden wave of public sector LinkedIn commentary that kind of misses the mark. It is a dangerous space to play in, and you've got to be like. I turned 60 next year. I really couldn't give a damn. So that's partly, why I throw a bit of caution to the wind. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it for everyone. So, I mean, I encourage people to be on platforms like that, but not to be reckless about it. And also, just to kind of recognise your own risk tolerance as well. But, I mean, I think like I said before, the ways to do it practically, I think, are leaders have to reward people who fail gallantly, right? If they've failed doing all the right things, then we've got to kind of make a real point of putting them on a pedestal as well as the people who have succeeded. That's one thing to do. I mean, I'm fond of the old saying of, you can't think your way into new ways of acting. You've got to act your way into new ways of thinking. And what that says, I think, is that in terms of what you address first, do you address the thinking or the frameworks, or do you address the behaviour? I think we have to address the behaviour. So encouraging appropriate risk-taking, whatever that might look like in the public sector, encouraging that will create the culture. You don't kind of somehow mystically create the culture and then have that flow to behaviour. You've got to encourage behaviours, and then over time that'll influence culture. So there are really practical things you can do to turn this around, I think. And certainly in agencies I've led, this one and the last one, I think we've tried to do that.
We've got one at the back and then we'll take one down here.
With regards to encouraging behaviour, as a transition from private sector into public sector recently, only a year and a half or so, I was very startled that my HR team told me that I wouldn't get rewarded for achieving objectives in my role. The only way I could get a pay rise was to actually stay there for a year and I'd get the CPI. How do you encourage innovation and talent retention without actually, dangling the carrot financially to do your job really well?
I'm
glad it's not me asking the hard questions.
What was the question? What?
Without financially incentivising employees of the public service to achieve KPIs and objectives, but just to sit in the seat, or leave that role and go for a higher role at a different band. If you're actually happy with your role and you just want to do really well at it, there's not that much motivating you besides career progression. Financial motivation is pretty motivating.
I suppose you'd say this is easy for me to say because I'm on a DG salary, but I don't think salary is the only motivator for most people. I think, there's a whole bunch, it's a very personal thing, I know, but it's individual to each individual. But I think that there are many motivators for doing great work in the public sector. And as I said, on a DG salary, you'd expect me to say that, I suppose, but I meet people in the public sector all the time who get their kicks out of seeing the great outcomes that they achieve. They don't necessarily want to link it. They don't necessarily need it to be linked to financial reward. The public sector, because we've got the scrutiny, obviously, that comes with public sector life, we can't use remuneration to incentivise like the private sector can. I miss my KPMG bonuses dearly. But I recognise that in the public sector, it's just we're more constrained. We can't reward and incentivise in that way. But that's okay because I think in the public sector, for most public servants, they kind of get a great kick and a reward by seeing the outcomes of their work.
So we've got time.
Money would be nice.
We've got time for 3 questions, and I think we've got hands up all over the place. So.
Great, thank you. My name's Sally Noonan, spent a long time in the public service. Just really interested, Mike, thank you for your comments. Love what you're saying about sort of resilience and being bold and taking risks. The Queensland economy is on the precipice of what could be a massive change with respect to the structure of the economy, the reliance on fossil fuels, moving towards renewables, lots of incredibly exciting things going on. You talked about retooling. Just really interested in your thoughts around, the big kind of elephants in the room, like structural adjustment, that big kind of reform, what that means for the regions in particular. And what you think is really needed from government to make that happen in a way that's inclusive.
Yeah, so I say in my department right now that Queensland in the future, in 30 years' time, Queensland will have a hydrogen industry, we'll have a renewables industry, we'll have a critical minerals industry, we'll have a sustainable aircraft fuel industry. We'll have all of those industries because the world will demand it from us and they will happen, right? But they won't be as good as they can be and they won't be optimised for benefiting Queenslanders, optimised for public benefit, unless the government leans into creating those industries in a way which maximises benefit for Queenslanders. We'll have them, but it's our job to do them properly. And that means doing it in an inclusive way for regional communities that are impacted. It means, for example, finding a way to get a return to taxpayers out of hydrogen. Just to explain that, it's not a resource, it's not a traditional resource, so there's no way of charging a royalty. So sure, there'll be jobs and taxes, but how do we get a return for Queenslanders out of hydrogen? These and many other challenges in all of those industries that we know will develop in Queensland over the next 30 years are the public services job to solve. And in digital GIP at the moment, I was talking to the State Development Division the other day and I said, we're at a point in time in history where I get the sense that, these are really big, important challenges. They're crucial to Queensland's future prosperity. There must be someone really smart working on these things. But then I think, oh shit, that's us. It's us that Queenslanders are relying upon to ensure continued prosperity into the future as we completely change the Queensland economy. I mean, that's worth getting out of bed for, I think. And to know that it won't happen in a way that's optimised without our involvement is really motivating. But again, none of that will happen if we take this bullshit kind of, our job is to level the playing field. No, it's not. It's to pick winners and to invest in them and hope they come off. It's not to, only fill market gaps, or fix market failures. It's to create the markets. Let's not accept the rhetoric that commentators and many in the private sector impose upon the public sector, which kind of limits our involvement in these things or crimps our style. Leo Hilscher, who I had come and talk to the resources department really early on, is a public servant. He was a public servant who went and stood toe-to-toe with the Utah Development Corporation and did a deal with them on behalf of the people of Queensland to open up the Bowen Basin. And what he did was he said, you're going to need railway lines and ports, but you're going to loan us the money. You're going to loan the government the money so that we can build and own that infrastructure, and then we'll pay the loan back by charging you to use them. Now, that's a PPP I can get into. We're going to need that level of courage and risk-taking, now as we create those new industries into the future, we're going to need to conjure up that kind of, spirit of Leo Hilscher to go and do those deals on behalf of the people of Queensland to make sure that we get our fair share.
I think question over there.
Mike. Hi, I'm Gillian Gardner. I'm in the innovation portfolio alongside Tourism and Sport at the moment. My question's back to your thoughts around leadership development. I was really struck by your comments around the capability frameworks and that kind of try and plug the module in thing. If you were able to have your way with that framework, what kind of thinking would you apply to how do we create leaders with that kind of risk appetite, courage and the spirit of Leo that we need to take Queensland where it needs to go?
So a couple of years ago, I read a book which changed my life. It was called 9 Lies About Work. And it basically takes every HR concept and rips it apart based on evidence, and completely changed my way of how to lead organisations and what we need to do in these kinds of spaces. So, one of the things that book talks about is early work from the Gallup organisation. You know the Gallup organisation, an organisation that's now global, deals in leadership. They were commissioned to do a study of what differentiated pubs that were really financially successful versus those that weren't. And they went and looked at the attributes of the pub managers. What they discovered, again, it was one of these exercises in search of what's the competency we need to plug into pub managers to get them to lead great financially profitable pubs. What they discovered was they couldn't find one. One pub leader was knocking the lights out, shooting the lights out financially because they were really good at, creating a fantastic atmosphere, in the pub that brought in customers. Another one was really financially successful because they were fantastic at getting the best possible, alcohol deals in a procurement sense. So what they concluded was, and this is the point, what they concluded was that there is no single formula to leadership success, that what it's about is recognising your strength, doubling down on it because the return on investment in investing in your strengths is far higher than the return on investment you'll get from trying to fix your faults. So identify your strengths, double down on them, and be splendidly, wonderfully idiosyncratic about it. And use the strengths that you have, double down on the strengths that you have, invest in the strengths that you have in order to create the one thing that all leaders have in common, and that's followers. But it'll vary from person to person. Does that make sense?
We've got time for one more, Rob. Come on, Rob, let us have one
Mike.
Oh, no.
Chantal. Great outfit choice, by the way.
Thank you for your advice.
Yeah. So in your career trajectory, you've always made a big splash. Sometimes negative, sometimes positive, but always in your career.
Oh.
But it's always been... It has.
Stick around, there's still time.
Well, and this is the question. So what is the legacy for DG? Sorry, it's my timer.
What's the legacy for?
For you in this role as DG?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, look, like most humans, I get satisfaction out of thinking that I've made a difference. Right? So, you know, in whatever department I'll lead, you know, I'll try to make that difference. I'll try to find a way of being able to, in my doddering old age, look back and say, yep, I played a part in that. You know, that'll be good for me, both in terms of the outcomes of the department that I lead, but also in terms of, I hope, a legacy that I can leave for the public servants I've led, the public servants I've worked with. I'd really like to be able to do something about, you know, the things that I've talked about tonight that I find to be a bit disturbing about the potential trajectory of the public service. I'd like to, in some small way, turn that around. Rob's winding us up.
Yeah.
No, well, I have a question. I had to get up to have a chance to answer the question.
I hope it's not about...
Before I go into the defence of the PSC leadership capability, which are actually on the same page, it's just that you're looking at it from the back and I'm looking at it from the front.
Oh,
I guess my question is about the... Coldrake let the sun shine in, and he pointed to a number of areas where he feels the public sector culture of accountability was lacking, and he pointed to the issue of leadership. I guess I'm interested in your reflection, having you been on that leadership space on the side of politics, and now you're on the leadership side and the part of government. That interface is a hostile and at times challenging and demanding environment. What insights can you give from being on both sides? Because most people here would probably aspire to be at that interface and make a difference through influencing collaboratively how the state progresses. What's your observation that might be a take-home message?
Well, I've been blessed in the two ministers that I've had to deal with. You know, Scott Stewart and now Stephen Miles have both been absolute, you know, pleasures to deal with. So I feel like I haven't had the same experience that, you know, I understand some public servants have had around, you know, around having a more challenging minister to deal with. So I haven't, you know, it's not my experience that that's a difficult interface. And certainly when I was on the political side of things, I always thought it was completely daft to be hostile, to have a hostile relationship with the public service, because, you know, they were our arms and legs. They were the people who could give us great advice. They were the people who had resources to do things that we couldn't do. They were the people who, you know, through whom we, as on the political side of the fence, would get things done. So the idea that you'd not have anything other than a respectful, constructive working relationship and be prepared to take advantage of all of their advice and resources was just like, I didn't understand why people did it any other way. And I've not had the experience on this side of the fence of a challenging relationship. Mind you, I think it helps that I'd like to think I'm prepared to be frank and fearless. I'm prepared to be, I'm prepared to push back. I'm prepared to say, I don't think that's a good idea, Minister. You know, I understand there are challenging relationships. It's not been my experience.
Yep, no, that's great. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in thanking Mike? It's been an extraordinarily candid evening, and I thank you for that. I want to acknowledge Luminary as a sponsor for this evening, and there's a small, I think it's edible, Mike, Russell, so
I get to sponsor you and I get a gift.
I know,
Wow.
that's what we
I
do.
might keep doing this. Thank you.
It's how IPA operates, so please join me in acknowledging Luminary and thanking them. Also, in terms of IPA, Ian Stewart, former Police Commissioner, has been the President of IPA for the last 3 years. He welcomed my invitation to step into that space and done an extraordinary job to get us through. So I want to acknowledge Ian for his contribution and thank him for that. Tonight is our penultimate event for the year as IPA. Please register for our final webinar, Looking Back and Looking Forward, an Economic Perspective with guest senior economist from Westpac Business, Westpac, there you go, Mike, at MGD Wealth. End of year celebrations the 15th of December, and individual membership, of course, garners that visit. Vandula and Erin, thank you so much. Andrew can't be here tonight, he's unwell. They're the sort of the team that holds IPA together and works tirelessly to put them on, so I would like to acknowledge their contribution and encourage you to hang around for a while, have a drink, have a chat, reflect on tonight's conversation while I get Mike behind this banner here and give him an insight into the leadership capability model for the PSC. Thank you all for coming. Please stay and enjoy the night. Actually, I have one more gift. Those who have been invited by Mike to give feedback on his department received a letter that had attached to it a Kit Kat. A tiny, weeny, pissant Kit Kat. So in acknowledging Mike's contribution tonight, IPA has a chocolate for Mike, but it's a chocolate. Thank you, Mike.